The first task is to look at context. Context can be seen on two levels. It can be seen when the film was set, so this film was set in the 1950s, but it can also have meaning for when the film was made. This film was made in the 90s. And we can also interpret the film by or through an audience's point of view today. So for example, in the 50s, society was very different. The Second World War had just finished. Men were more educated and could get really good jobs. So everybody lived in a middle-class society, which meant that they could buy lots of stuff, and they all tried to be exactly the same. And civil rights was quite a new thing. In the 90s, though, which is when the film was made, there were now lots of different groups of people which were being shown in film for the first time. And all races were now accepted. And other groups were also trying to be accepted and represented in film that hadn't been before. Like, for example, people with disabilities. What's important about the 1950s is that society was very white and it was very middle class. There was this act that they brought in called the Returned Servicemen's Act, and this allowed all of the males that had been fighting in the war to go to university and to get home loans. So everybody was doing pretty well financially. It also meant that they all lived in the suburbs, just like Orewa. And they all tried to reach something called the American dream. Because everyone was doing so well, everybody wanted to buy lots of stuff. So that's where this whole idea of consumer culture came from. It came from the 1950s. The TV and the car became really important, and everybody really strove to what they called keeping up with the Joneses. And this meant trying to make sure that you always had what your neighbour had. Something else that's also quite cool about the 50s is that the term the teenager actually became a word that was used. Before then, they never really had a name for you guys. You were just younger people. And of course, with the birth of the teenager came the idea of juvenile delinquency, which means teenagers rebelling against their parents. And they did rebel. They didn't like the fact that their parents were so predictable and lived in the suburbs. The teenagers didn't really like the clean living lifestyle that their parents represented. They liked rock and roll and punk music, and they didn't like conformity or the rigid obedience that their parents had. Now let's look at the 1990s. In the 1990s, it could be said that films started pushing the envelope and were not only about traditional white middle-class nuclear families. Films started to be made about different groups of people. Make sure that you click on the link in the PowerPoint so that you can do some background reading on the context of Edward Scissorhands. This will help you with the task for this PowerPoint. So what do you have to do? You have to pretend that you are interviewing somebody from the 1950s about what life was like back then. Pick a character from the film and complete the following tasks. You must read the information in the slide and from the link. You will then have to come up with 10 questions and 10 answers for the interview. These need to be written down. You then need to make sure that the questions cover important aspects of what life was like back in the 1950s. You will then film your interview, and this needs to be embedded into your keynote or your PowerPoint and must be a part of your study guide. This should be finished in just over a lesson, so you may have some homework.